Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Issues of the Heart podcast. I'm your host, Brother Kobe.
And I'm Rogers. And today we're talking about Russia and Ukraine. We did a previous video on that. I would encourage you to go back and to watch it to help to get a foundation footing of what we're talking about. And today is really the question is, are we entering World War III? Since the previous broadcast that we did, things have escalated in some of the response that America and the rest of the world have had. As a result, it raises questions. People are asking, well, are we on the brink of World War III? Others are stating that we are in World War III, and some of you have looked at the fulfillment of certain scriptures or the prophecies of certain scriptures in Ezekiel 38 and 39, and suggest that we are on the brink of Armageddon, where this is the last battle. And this usually simmers up and begins to percolate whenever there's a war in the Middle East or in Europe somewhere, or particularly as it relates to Russia. As we did previously, it's important to go back and to get a proper historical context and understand, well, where are some of the people getting the idea that we're maybe entering World War III? And there's some that say, well, hey, 3 wars were prophesied or predicted. And these are all man-inspired by powers such as the Illuminati, the New World Order, the Rothschilds, the Council on Foreign Relations, the list goes on and on and on. Essentially, the idea is that there are global elites that are seeking world dominion and world domination. And depending on who you talk to, some would suggest that these persons are pawns, or they're manipulated or controlled by Satan, and that they're his agents trying to pull these things together. And of course, in the big push is, well, the Vatican is pulling all these different entities together to be able to bring about this collapse of government in the New World Order. And so we're going to look at that from a historical perspective, as well as from a scriptural perspective, to be able to understand. I will say before we jump in that in the last few days, the gas prices have gone up significantly in America, and people look at that and say, "Hey, this is a sign. This is definitely it." In Southern California, right before the sanctions were announced on importing Russian oil, prices were maybe $5 and some cents a gallon, maybe 5.19. And right after that, they went up to like 6.29 that day. And then when the afternoon, I came back in, it was like 6.49. And then as of last checking, it was like 6.79 and so forth. So people are like, hey, this is it. I will caution again, for being an economist, the market does not drive the price or let me clarify that. Oil companies do not drive the price. The market is created by supply and demand, how much the consumer is willing to pay for a product. So if the oil manufacturers or producers said that they would love to be able to get $10 a gallon, but you're only willing to pay $2 a gallon, you can want $10 a day all day, but if you're not willing to pay that, then it's not going to work. And so a couple of basic economic principles, of course, that will be at work, but the general principle that you've learned about from being a kid is supply and demand. And so even though we only receive 3% of oil imports from Russia, many European countries receive up to 40%, 50%, et cetera. And so think of it as America's only receiving 3%. We export a lot of oil, but the overall market in terms of how much oil is brought in, that amount is going to be greatly reduced from what Russia contributes daily, like 7 million gallons or barrels of oil. So that's going to be removed from the equation. So consequently, then you're going to have then the tightening of the market, because now you have less supply, still same demand. So what does that mean? It means prices will go up. If you have a whole lot of supply, less demand, prices go down and so forth. Again, that'll probably another conversation for another day, but that does not symbolize a strategic mark that, okay, well, this is going to bring about World War III, because as some people say, well, look, economic policies will be so hard in America that will make a change. And so it's going to cause people to go with this New World Order. Well, let's pump the brakes and stop and go back and see where this stems from. We'll go back into the 1800s by a man by the name of Albert Pike. And Albert Pike was a general in the Confederate Army, and he also fought in the Mexican and American War. Albert Pike made quote, a prediction of sorts that people say is a prediction. And in it, he predicted that there would be 3 world wars. He, of course, was a Freemason, and there are many who feel that the Freemasons are seeking to control the world. There's our brainchild or stepchild of various groups in the hierarchy. So whether you're dealing with the Skull and Bones, Councils on Foreign Relations, Bilderbergers, and so forth. All of these groups, Carlyle Group, and so forth. All these groups, they really have one purpose, and so they are trying to be able to bring about world dominion and to bring about a new world order system of government. You probably even seen on the back of a dollar bill, someone may have pointed out to you that it says Novus Order Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages. And the idea is that in 1776, a man by the name of Adam Weishaupt founded the Illuminati. And that all-seeing eye that you see in the pyramid or the capstone of the dollar bill is suggesting that there's an all-seeing eye. And as Christians, we say, well, the all-seeing eye is God. In the mind of those who postulate the Illuminati conspiracy and New World Order conspiracy, they see that all-seeing eye as being a sign of Lucifer, that Lucifer is trying to set up a government on earth, which we understand from the books of Genesis through Revelation, that in that respect, that he is. The question, though, that we would entertain, and some people look at, well, that he uses, or that he will use power players, a global elite, people in Hollywood and so forth, to be able to, politicians, to pull this together. And so in short, the net effect is that by those who espouse the view that you cannot be in any position of influence, you cannot be in a position of authority unless you have somehow sold out to Lucifer into these powers. So in short, if you want to be the president of the country, you have to be a Luciferian. If you want to be in charge of a large corporation, have to be a Luciferian. If you're in charge of a large media complex, again, you have to be a Luciferian. If you're in charge of a large school. And so the idea just goes on and on. You get the picture. So that essentially all these folks are in on part of this conspiracy. We're going to Albert Pike. The premise is set then that he received the vision in circa 1871 that there would be 3 world wars. In the first world war that took place, and of course, this is 1871, the First World War would not take place until roughly 40 years after the fact. This is purported to have been written by him. However, many researchers find that there's no evidence that he actually spoke or said these things. This is, by modern language, hearsay. That people say, well, this is never written. We have no evidence of it, but it comes through us to us as hearsay. Nonetheless, let's explore it. Quickly, the First World War, as identified, was to be fought between, and I'm reading from what he has supposedly stated, the First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the czars in Russia and of making that country a fortress of atheistic communism. The divergence is caused by the agenda or the agents of the Illuminati between the British and Germanic empires will be used to foment this war. At the end of the war, communism will be built and used in order to destroy the other governments and in order to weaken the religions. So when those who are big proponents of the Albert Pike, Adam Weishaupt, Illuminati conspiracy, New World Order conspiracy, and so forth, they point to World War I and say, look, in World War I, this took place. You have the powers of Britain against the Germanic powers, and this is significant. And then at the end of it, you had communism that rose out of it. Well, if we are students of history, you know that in the 1920s, that communism began to be founded. In fact, you go back before that, look at the works of Karl Marx. You look at the work of Lenin, Stalin, etc., who were various leaders of the USSR, or the Soviet Empire. That after World War I, these things began to come into place. And so in the 20s, you had the beginning of the Red Army. And so in the teachings and the ideas there was that the Soviet Union, in which, again, for our purposes, we identify as not a country, not Russia, but a collection of like 14 different states. They will begin to foment and to come under the umbrella of communism. And in short, what is communism? Communism is where the people, they would own the factories, they would own the lands, they would own the materials, and they would make production and divide it up to people based upon the needs they had, the communal needs. Very different from capitalism. In that capitalism, the people, the businesses will own things, and also there'll be private ownership as well. But people receive based upon their actual labor, their actual contribution. So in capitalism, if you work and your wage is $10, well, you receive $10. In communism, everyone will receive the same thing. It's really a system of equality. And that was really like the epitome of what Karl Marx espoused. And of course, there's socialism, which is different from that. In that particular system, you have where the people also, they're the producers of the capital, the labor, and so forth. But in that, everything is divided again based upon needs. So slightly different orientation, but very, very similar. Communism, in it, it did not espouse the belief of God or the belief in God. Rather, people were not, did not have the idea of Christianity as what we know and understand. There was a general rejection of God. Other ideas and so forth came in. But he predicted that this would be an impact and it would be used to destroy the other governments and to weaken the nations. And so now you look at it still, even though maybe one checkpoint is correct, has it been used to destroy the other governments and to weaken the nations? I think we would have to categorically answer no. Now, history again attests that there are only three communist countries. And in fact, they're not true, pure communist countries. There has not been a purely communistic country ever. But we look at this at just a broad view, broad stroke, and we say, well, this can't be an exact fulfillment. But even if we want to give credit, hey, we'll go ahead and give credit. Let's look at the second one very quickly. Number two, the Second World War. This was to be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm. And again, people in this, they see Russia and communism as fulfilling this in the wars with Adolf Hitler. As you know, Germany attacked Russia, and during the World War II, America and Russia were allies, and so of course Great Britain, and so it was the Axis powers versus the Allied powers. At the end of World War II, when Hitler's soldiers surrendered, when Japan surrendered, and when the victory was given in for the Allied powers, Russia essentially, the USSR, disappeared behind the curtain. It still was going to be a powerful nation, but it would not have the same affairs in the relationship that was with the United States. We move into an era or a period of time which we refer to as the Cold War. Now it's called the Cold War because there were no actual, no heat, no fires, no weaponry was fired, but the relationship between the nations was cold and frosty, and there was a looming threat that there would be a possibility of nuclear war. And so in the 60s, late 50s and 60s and so forth, school children all throughout America prepared for the inevitable, that there could be a nuclear conflict between America and between Russia. And as a result, they were prepared by hiding under desks. What should they do in case there was a nuclear fallout? We had seen what would take place if there was an atomic bomb that was dropped, if there were a nuclear war that would take place, from looking at Nagasaki. So we know that that would certainly be an issue. But those things never came to pass. Even though the tensions continued to escalate and to become very high, it never happened. The closest probably was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which JFK had to figure out, what do we do to de-escalate the situation? In it, the USSR had nuclear warheads was to bring nuclear warheads into Cuba. And that brought a major issue because Cuba is no more than like 50 miles or so off the coast of Florida. This would have given the power to Russia or the USSR a distinct advantage of being able to fire a nuclear weapon and to strike major cities in America within just a few moments. And so that tension was there. And again, it de-escalated from where it was. That pushes us then to the third piece then of the prediction. And again, truly not necessarily accurate predictions, but we'll give credit. The third one is the Third World War is to be fomented between taking advantage of the differences caused by the agents of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and political Zionism, the state of Israel, mutually destroy each other. So quickly, what he predicted was that there would be a Third World War between Islam and the Muslim Arabic world and Zionism or Israel. And so that really sets the stage. Of course, when you add it into other Bibles, such as like the Scofield Bible and so forth, and the general teaching that exists in Christianity, that there would be a global conflict between Israel and the powers of the world that would gather around Israel, according to the prophecies of Ezekiel 38, 39, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Revelation, etc. So they see in this a movement to be able to destroy Israel. Well, let's backtrack just for a moment again and clarify. In this supposed Third World War that was to take place, according to Pike, it would happen between Islam and between Christianity. We know that this is not taking place. The closest that people would point to is to say that, well, 9/11, that was the Third World War. We entered World War III in 9/11. Well, if you quickly look at that, and maybe not even quickly, but you go back and look and see, you'll find that that is not the case. No, that is not the case. In fact, in World War I, almost all the world was engaged in the conflict, hence World War is the title. And World War II, even more nations were involved in the conflict. Fighting was everywhere. But again, that would pale in comparison to what took place in this last World War III that is supposed to have been predicted and to have taken place between Islam and between Christianity. When we look at the map, you'll see that is nowhere near. Fighting is only in several countries, primarily in Afghanistan. And so for 20 years, the United States, along with a number of allies through NATO, fought in Afghanistan, trying to go after the Taliban, to find Osama bin Laden, etc. In this escalation, this was not a fight against Islam. This was not a fight against Muslims. This was a fight against some terrorists who have brought attacks against America and other nations throughout the world. So the teaching then of the idea of Albert Pike, it then falls flat. And the Bible says in that when a person claiming to be a prophet makes a prediction and the thing doesn't come to pass, then we can know that that certainly is not a prophet that God has spoken by, given a revelation. So we then have to look at Albert Pike and the others, the minions that carry the same idea, and look at it and to evaluate it based on its own merits. And thus we'll conclude that the teachings are not consistent then with Scripture. So what is Scripture really talking about? Because there are people still who say, well, again, this is Russia. So very quickly, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38 and 39, it talks about Gog and Magog. The idea that many have is that from verse 2, the Bible says the son of Rosh, to speak to the prince of Rosh. And so they use that to say, well, that sounds like Russia. That sounds like Russia. Now, that's interesting that you're making a whole prediction because something sounds like it. It sounds similar to it. And so we're going to make a whole prediction based off of that. The reality of it is that that is not, again, the teaching that is to be brought to bear. That's not what is happening there. But that's the idea, that because it sounds like it, then it is. Well, again, if you look in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, you'll see that the issue that is there is one that Gog and Magog, Magog is the land, but Gog is coming forth to attack Israel. This would have been fulfilled had the people from Ezekiel's time, had they been true and faithful unto Jehovah. They went back and they would have done the work that he called them to do. Unfortunately, it didn't transpire as such. But in the writing of Ezekiel, he's writing as what should have been. So Gog and Magog would have come with other nations seeking to fight against Israel. And what would have happened? Well, this would have been an opportunity for God to deliver Israel. And so when you read Ezekiel 38 and 39, it then talks about the utter destruction that's going to rest upon Gog and Magog. It's so much so that for 7 years, their bodies would be gathered up and they'll be burned. Bones might be apparent here or there, and someone will walk by and they'll see a bone and say, hey, what's this bone from? And someone will tell the story. This is because of the attack of Gog, and then throw it back into the fire. God would use that to be able to deliver his people from the coalition of evil people seeking to attack his own. And then in the ending of chapter 38, it speaks about then a revival that would take place, how people would learn about God and the knowledge of God would cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. It's reminiscent of what we read in Revelation chapter 20. In Revelation chapter 20, John then borrows this similar language in describing the end. He says that after this, 1,000 years are expired, and Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and he shall go forth into the four corners of the earth to gather together Gog and Magog to battle against God in the great day of battle of God, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And so John then describes Gog and Magog, not these same people, but now people who are fighting in the end time. It's a symbol that is being used of people who would fight against God, who would be defiant against God. And in this particular case, now they're fighting against spiritual Israel. And in the same in the book of Ezekiel, how literal Israel was to be preserved by God. In the book of Revelation, spiritual Israel is to be preserved by God. So the semblance that is there that people will try to use and say, well, hey, we're on the beginning of World War III. Reality is, no, we're not. This is not the beginning of World War III. We'll stop here in one or 2 points. America is not interested in going to battle with Russia. Russia is not interested in going to battle against America. If the two were to fight, then I will put my bottom dollar on America being able to win. If we look at the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the great resources that America has, the manpower, the technology, all of those things. Well, you might be saying, well, no, they're not going to attack us with arms. They're going to try cyber attacks, and they're going to try to be able to disrupt the economy because of the ability to be able to infiltrate and to break and to hack into networks and so forth and so on. Again, if I had to put my bottom dollar down, it would be on America in that particular contest. And so, yeah, there are people who would try to be sleuths and so forth. But again, I think the best and the brightest is certainly here in America. So this is not a battle that is being fought in the context of right versus wrong or Revelation or Ezekiel. Rather, this is an aggression from a power simply seeking to try to build back up and to reunite what was formerly the Soviet Empire. So we look and we see it taking place before our eyes, and certainly there are going to be casualties, a loss of life as we have seen, but it will not escalate and just blow over into the situation of a World War III. Again, we don't have any indication of it in prophecy. There will still be wars. There will be rumors of wars. These things will come to pass until the very end. But our redemption is in the fact that what Jesus has promised us, that he will come and that he will put an end to all these things, not to be worried about the fanciful interpretations that some will bring that will make us think that somehow this is a quote prophecy or this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Unfortunately, it's more fodder that people are creating and imagining that is not based upon the pure word.
Yeah, well, it can be a world war because, as we see, NATO is not helping out.
Nope.
This is two-person war, and even though you've had some volunteers from different places going down to the Ukraine to help the people out, again, it's a two-nation war. Um, so I've heard different things like America. Farrakhan even said in his swan song speech that America is at some point going to jump into this war. And some people are even predicting the downfall of America. But again, according to prophecy, that can't come to pass because America is spoken of in Bible prophecy. That's not how she ends. So America will remain a superpower until the end when different things begin to transpire. So again, to have a world war, you're going to have different nations that's going to need to join in, and we don't see this at this particular time. Neither do I predict that other nations will join in. And one of the things about it, when you look at Daniel, just aside from the Gog and Magog, many people, when you look at Daniel chapter 11 in particular, when you're talking about the end of things, and I'm going to view this from the standpoint of the mind state of other people who they take a very literalistic approach to Daniel 11, the last verses when it mentions in verse 40, and at the time of the end. All right, the king of the south shall push against the king of the north, and you have this battle taking place. People begin to look at this king of the north that this is referring to Turkey, or you may say Islamic nations, right? So this is Islam coming on the attack. However, just again, from the viewpoint of others looking at this from a very literalistic place, they come then to attack the glorious land, or what we may call Palestine, or attack Israel. And within that, it mentions Edom, Moab, Ammon. We know that those nations as nations or as a people do not exist. So then they take the geography of those nations, which again is still Palestinian, right? So now you have Islamic nations going on the attack against Palestinian people, or mainly Israel. And one of the things that it says about this is that the nations of Ethiopia, Egypt, Lydia, those are African nations or nations on the continent of Africa. So now you will have the allied forces of Islamic nations, but mainly when you look at the Egypt and Lydia, those type of nations, not necessarily Ethiopia, but then Ethiopia can be looked at as dealing with, the black people. And when I say black people, meaning just the people in that particular region, right? Africans. And we know that many of those nations are occupied by Islam. Those are Islamic nations, as we would call them. So then people look at this holy war between then Islamic forces and Israel, right? That will be taking place typically from here geographically in the Middle East. And that's how this battle is going forth in those particular verses. And the interesting thing about it, if you want to talk about a world war, the nations that were mentioned and the place that was mentioned here, and again, I'm dealing with the viewpoint of others. I'm not saying I believe this or this is what the Bible teaches. I'm saying this is what people take from it. That being the case, then this war that we see doesn't fit this criteria, all right, about how the end comes to pass. Because again, where's the Islamic forces? Where is Israel in the mix of this? Where the geographical location will be typically in the Middle East, not in European states. So, or the European continent. So again, it doesn't fit. And again, the Bible shows us in Daniel chapter 11, this is how the world, quote unquote, comes to an end. In that sense, with Michael standing up, the great prince who stands for the children of his people, he stands up and ends the the raid or the war fest that's going on with this king of the north trying to invade quote unquote his land. And so again, what's going on now, what we see doesn't fit the criteria for what is presented in Daniel chapter 11. Lastly, I will say this, when it comes to wars in the end, the Bible talks about Revelation chapter 16, this battle of Armageddon taking place. And when you look at that, those are the nations, the kings of the earth. We're talking about a world war. All the nations of the earth arrayed against God in the person of his people. In other words, they are fighting against God, but they can't literally fight him. So they war against his people. And so when Jesus literally said the whole world will hate you and will be against you, those words will come to pass before it is all said and done. And then the culmination after the millennium in Revelation chapter 20 shows us the loss of all ages, literally trying to fight against God, the city of God, God himself, right? And we know how that ends. And so again, when people are looking at wars to predict what the ending will be, this doesn't fit that criteria. So if people are trying to make more out of this than what needs to be, then biblically we're verily off track. And people, this whole America thing, people predicting the downfall of America, and we're going to get to that at some point, in the future. But that's not America's role. America's role is not going to be being necessarily taken down by another, especially not Russia. So that's not going to happen. And that's why understanding, again, the Bible and prophecy is so important, because we don't know the future, but we do know the future, right? We don't know how everything is going to play out, but we know how certain things are going to play out. And so that's why the very elect, Jesus said, will not be deceived by these things that take place.
We're going to jump into some other pieces of it and to discuss it more in detail, because as you mentioned there, I think it's extremely clear that would not be the case. But the other side, people say, well, they start the fighting, it's going to build up and boil over like a pot on the stove, that the pressure is too much and it begins to foam out and to blow over. Again, these other nations, they're not involved. To your point, as you mentioned, NATO's like, hey, this isn't a NATO nation. We're not getting involved. We'll give you armament, we can give you some supplies and so forth, but we're not getting involved because this is not an issue of a NATO nation and so forth. And we do well to learn the scriptures and to be able to see them. But we'll talk about it more in detail. Now, if you have questions or comments, certainly put it down in the comment box, and we'll come back in a future episode and answer that. And so again, thank you for joining in and spending this time with us. We ask to do it again. Let us know whatever comments or questions that you have. We'll get those taken care of. Until next time, remember the true proverb to keep your heart with all diligence, because out of it are the issues of life.